Mr. President, and I'll pick up where I left off before the break, which was speaking about the Tataka review into whether legal fee payments to state servants appearing before the Commission were warranted or not. It's apparently underway, but no update has been forthcoming from the government, although I note just now during our question time I did receive some belated answers to questions on that same matter. We're still not entirely sure when it's arriving to its completion, that report. The Weiss review also into the Paul Reynolds matter is scheduled to be made public by the end of June, and when it is made public, I hope it is in its entirety with as little as possible redacted. Yet there remains gaps Mr. President, there remains many gaps the government could be filling in the meantime. The most glaring being that Ashley Youth Detention Centre should be closed now, not in 2026. In August last year, the Commissioner's closing statement asserted the following: "It is our view that Ashley Youth Detention Centre should be closed as a matter of urgency." 3 years to deliver that outcome is not acting as a matter of urgency. Mr. President, another clanging silence amongst the government's stated list of priorities in the Governor's address was climate change. I'm sorry, but I just cannot fathom the government's apparent ostrich head in the sand approach to the climate change emergency. Mr. President, somebody needs to tell the ostrich that the seas are rising and that insulating sandbank may not be there for very much longer. A recent article published in The Guardian on the 8th of May this year reported that, and I quote, "Hundreds of the world's leading climate scientists expect global temperatures to rise at least 2.5 degrees Celsius, 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels this century, blasting past internationally agreed targets and causing catastrophic consequences for humanity and the planet." Mr. President, I have previously stated in this place that the climate change emergency is a social justice issue as much as it is an ecological one. They are intrinsically intertwined. In fact, the United Nations refer to climate justice, which recognises how climate change will exacerbate and entrench structural and socio-economic inequalities and intergenerational inequality. For example, things many of us take for granted: access to healthy food, clean water, heating, cooling, will become more expensive for those who can afford it least. According to the same Guardian article of the 8th of May, climate scientists are angry and scared at government inaction globally, and I quote, "Many of the scientists envisage a semi-dystopian future with famines, conflicts and mass migration driven by heat waves, wildfires, floods and storms of an intensity and frequency far beyond those that have already struck. Numerous experts said they had been left feeling hopeless, infuriated and scared by the failure of governments to act, despite the clear scientific evidence provided. I think we are headed for major societal disruption within the next 5 years, says Greta Peckel at the University of Tasmania. Authorities will be overwhelmed by extreme event after extreme event. Food production will be disrupted. I could not feel greater despair over the future." End of quote from that article. 5 years, Mr. President, 5 years before major societal disruption. If that's not an emergency, and I do not know what is. Do we honestly believe we're prepared for that prediction? That could be the next term of government, presuming the current one goes a full term. So I call on the government to urgently reconsider and reinstate a dedicated Minister for Climate Change as a standalone portfolio. Further, we need to incorporate climate change benchmarks into reportable dashboards across all sectors applicable, and that includes environment and biodiversity, agriculture, marine and freshwater ecosystems, forestry, housing and construction, transport, energy and waste, domestic water supplies, planning, livable urban environments, food security and cost of living, to mention a few examples. Mr. President, the climate science is in. A key takeaway from that science is that an immediate way Tasmania could and should be acting on the climate emergency is by protecting our unique forests, our native forests. As respected Professor David Lindemeyer AO, who is based at the ANU in Canberra and is a world-leading expert in forest and woodland ecology, resource management, conservation science and biodiversity, said, and I quote, While there are many sources of emissions, it is only native forests that can remove carbon from the atmosphere at the scale and time required. Protecting and restoring native forests is a critical mitigation action if Australia is to meet its net zero emissions targets within the critical 1 to 3 decades. In one fell swoop of a pen, ceasing the senseless logging of our native forests means we immediately protect our vital carbon banks, our lifeblood waterways, many threatened species from extinction, as well as reduce cataclysmic bushfires we've seen escalate over previous decades. Mr President, additionally, I reiterate my earlier call, along with a range of community stakeholders, for a comprehensive independent root and branch inquiry into the Environment Protection Authority, the EPA Tasmania, to ensure it is effectively delivering on its statutory roles and also meeting community expectations in protecting and preserving Lutruwita Tasmania's treasured natural environment. Much more could and should be said on this. Suffice to say, the climate change story is being written whether we turn a blind eye to it or not. If we want to play a constructive part in that narrative, and I hope we all do, then we need to seize this rapidly shrinking moment and make up for lost time urgently. Mr President, I spoke earlier on the unique milestone which has undoubtedly strengthened our Parliament, the restoration of the Assembly to 35 MPs. As stated in the Governor's address, this Parliament will be different to previous years, and manifestly so, Mr President, on so many levels. And to quote again from Her Excellency's address, she said, "Tasmanians are fortunate to live in a democracy where they are free to speak, free to believe and free to vote without fear." Nobody could argue with that. We are indeed very fortunate. However, as events around the globe have thrown into stark relief, we cannot afford to take such good fortune for granted. Democracy can be surprisingly fragile. As the current custodians of this place, we have a collective responsibility to not just ensure this Parliament proves functional and effective, we must also invest in strengthening our democratic frameworks and good governance systems. Mr President, community stakeholders have made it very clear they expect this Parliament to undertake those strengthening measures. As members may be aware, earlier this month, the Susan McKinnon Foundation, a non-partisan public interest entity, released its Charter of Tasmanian Government and Parliamentary Reform 2024 document. It makes 9 recommendations spanning more rigorous political donations disclosures, strengthening our RTI laws and introducing truth in political advertising, to mention a few of its proposed reforms. The Australia Institute Tasmania also released this month its discussion paper, Democracy Agenda for the 51st Tasmanian Parliament Options for Reform. This paper presents 16 key areas for reform. Similarly, the CPSU Tasmanian branch also released its Integrity Roadmap for the Tasmanian public sector. This report offers 7 recommendations by which to address eroding public trust. In fact, we have multiple entities coming forward to provide guidance on strengthening the integrity of our democracy and governance. And this makes it clear this is an expression of both the need and the appetite that there is in the community to do so. Mr President, I wish to take the opportunity now to flag that at the conclusion of my contribution, I'll seek leave to table these 3 documents I've just mentioned. I believe it's appropriate to do so as they are all addressed to this Parliament for action by this Parliament. There are certain key areas of democratic reform I believe we must seize the opportunity presented by this new collaborative Parliament to prioritise, including the following that I'll mention briefly. The first, political donation disclosure laws. Boosting the rigour of political donations disclosure laws passed last year being a key area of unfinished business in this place. We must now move to reduce the disclosure amount to $1,000, introduce donations and expenditure caps for Assembly elections, as well as introduce truth in political advertising laws. Both the Australia Institute and the McKinnon Foundation reports emphasise the need for these reforms. Additionally, we need to address the lack of equity in the provision of public funding provided for in the current laws across both chambers, a democratic flaw also identified in the Australia Institute report. Second essential democratic reform I will highlight is around fixed-term elections. I've previously called for the introduction of fixed 4-year terms for the Assembly. Tasmania is the only state without this provision, despite former Premier Ray Groom introducing it for one term in the early 1990s. As a matter of interest, both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have indicated their in-principle support for fixed 4-year terms for the Commonwealth Parliament, which would leave Tasmania as the national outlier in this regard. As stated by the recent McKinnon Foundation Charter document, the introduction of fixed 4-year terms would promote certainty, support longer-term policy development and remove the advantage that incumbents have in choosing an election date for partisan purposes. Mr President, the third reform that I've mentioned briefly is to prioritise the establishment of a joint standing committee on electoral matters. Members will be aware I have long called for this Parliament to have a joint standing committee on electoral matters, as occurs at the Commonwealth Parliament, as well as both New South Wales and Victorian Parliaments. I will not go into further detail now, as I have tabled a motion to that effect in this place and are in discussions with members around it. However, it's worth pointing out that this reform is called for by the Australia Institute in its Democracy Agenda report and is publicly supported by other election experts and analysts. Another final measure to mention under this democracy banner is some further integrity measures which would shore up public trust and also the structures of our democracy. The ones I'll point to most pertinently, which I would actually regard as no-brainers, as per the colloquialism, Mr President, include legislating the lobbyist register and code of conduct as recommended by the Integrity Commission, developed carefully by the Commission over the last couple of years, implementing the grants reforms recommended again by the Integrity Commission and the work that they've put into the research papers on that topic in order to prevent pork barrelling at election time, the implementation of the Environmental Defenders Office 12 recommendations to strengthen our right to information laws presented in the report that they prepared last year. I'm also calling for an immediate review of our so-called whistleblower laws, the Public Interest Disclosure Act 2002. This is brought into sharp relief by activities at a federal level where whistleblowers at the moment are being jailed. We should be protecting whistleblowers, and our laws certainly are in need of review and updating. Mr President, while this may seem a big agenda of democratic reforms, this 51st Parliament presents opportunity and also exists within an appetite in the community and in members of this place to undertake this work. Indeed, having restored the numbers of the House of Assembly to provide for a more functional Parliament and stronger democracy, it's a natural extension to attend to these structural mechanisms to ensure that outcome is delivered. Mr President, also on the topic of integrity, there has clearly been growing disquiet regarding the effectiveness or otherwise of the Integrity Commission's capacity to deliver on community expectations of what it should or could do. I do not intend to repeat those concerns here now in great detail. However, I place on the record that I do share some of those concerns and do believe it's timely for there to be an independent and comprehensive review of the Integrity Commission's current legal framework and whether it's fit for purpose. Of equal importance to restore public confidence and trust, I believe, is strengthening transparency and accountability of complaints and potential misconduct within Tasmania Police. I do note here that, relevant to this topic, just today in the other place, the bug report of the review of the use of surveillance devices in prisons has now been tabled. I have not yet had the opportunity to read that report in detail, Mr President, but I welcome its completion and its publication. It's being made public today. We'll look forward to seeing what lessons can be learned from that investigation.
It's tabled here too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Was it?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. I've got a copy of it.
So, Mr President, I'm calling for today, in terms of restoring that public confidence and trust around complaints around potential misconduct within Tasmania Police, I'm calling for an appropriately resourced, empowered, independent police oversight authority to be established within the life of this Parliament. Such an authority should have a mandate for holding police accountable for potential criminality and misconduct and driving cultural change through that accountability. I acknowledge the hard work undertaken by our police force, often in tricky, if not dangerous, circumstances. However, recent episodes, including but not limited to the Paul Reynolds matter, have raised serious concerns and crisis of confidence within both the community as well as for some serving police officers. Internal investigation is now perceived as self-regulation, and that does not cut it for many people. further entrenching distrust and eroding confidence. This in itself is unfair to the many police officers with unblemished records. The time for self-regulation of police is long over. It is in the public interest, and it is in the interest of all police officers for there to be an independent police oversight authority in this state. Mr President, in February this year I undertook a study tour of New Zealand's Parliament with a specific interest in its integrity and ethics models and frameworks. This was an incredibly interesting and informative process. A key takeaway for me was the role and contribution made by their Independent Public Service Commission. There are lessons in that model for Tasmania, as there are also from models in other states, such as the WA Public Sector Commission. Of course, Tasmania previously had an Office of the State Service Commissioner, which was abolished in 2013. I do note that in the recently released Blake Review, recommendation 9 of that review states that government or the head of the State Service initiate a review of the decision to abolish the State Service Commissioner model in 2013. I cannot claim, Mr President, an in-depth understanding of why the Commission was abolished in 2013, but Blake notes it was a policy decision of the government at the time. I have heard reflections that abolishment was perhaps the easier option pursued at the time, rather than a re-examination of the appropriate functions of such a commission and a recommitment to appropriate funding of those functions. However, I fear the decision may have been a false economy. We may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater in abolishing the Commission. Given the considerable governance failures and poor practice identified by the Commission of Inquiry, I second the comment that's made by Mr Blake in his report that, and I quote, "It has now been more than 10 years since this change was made, and I believe it timely for the success or otherwise of this to be evaluated and comparison made with practices in other jurisdictions." This echoes comments also made by Dr Watt AO in his independent review of the Tasmanian State Service, where in relation to the abolished Office of the State Service Commissioner, he noted, and I quote, "The option of reinstatement, however, should however, be kept under consideration." Mr President, I'll move on from integrity matters, but I do wish to state that I'm also looking forward to attending in July this year the Australian Public Sector Anti-Corruption Conference, hosted in Darwin by Northern Territory's Independent Commissioner Against Corruption. This conference is going to hear from Australian and international anti-corruption experts on risk identification and management, emerging trends, innovative approaches to combat corruption and heighten workplace integrity systems. There'll be plenty to learn from there, Mr President, and you can be sure I'll bring some of that back here for discussion. Mr President, so far in my contribution I have covered some key matters of unfinished business, some opportunities to strengthen our democracy and governance, and now I move on to some areas for reform I'd like to highlight as opportunities in this 51st Parliament. As coincidence would have it, this week we are celebrating Law Week, yet it is surprising how silent the government is on its legislative agenda going forward. I've already mentioned some key areas of law reform, but others I'd hope are also on the government's top priority list include moving on its promised expungement of historical offences amendment bill. This is a significant acknowledgement of the serious impacts of past laws where criminalised male-to-male homosexuality, the discriminative nature of these laws and the harms that they caused. Expungement is important to set an appropriately inclusive tone for all Tasmanians. Crucially, through these laws, we must also include financial redress, recommended in the 2020 Independent Review of Expungement of Historical Offences Act 2017. Another long overdue law reform I'm hoping the government is prioritising is its redrafting the proposed laws to implement the promised ban on conversion practices as recommended by the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute report number 32 released in April 2022. I hope we see response to the community consternation at the draft bill proposed so far and a reassessment and redrafting of that bill more in line with the TLRI report. Speaking of the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute, Mr President, members may recall that in late April this year, the TLRI released its update report on a Charter of Human Rights for Tasmania. This timely report recommends that, and I quote, the laws in Tasmania be reformed to provide and promote specific, better and accessible protection for human rights through the enactment of a Tasmanian Charter of Human Rights or a Human Rights Act. This is the second time the TLRI has made this strong recommendation, the first time being 2007. The latest report also recommends, amongst its 21 recommendations, the establishment of a Parliamentary Human Rights Scrutiny Committee, a Human Rights Unit and a Human Rights Commissioner. I will not detail all 21 recommendations here now, Mr President, but it's clear this Parliament must seize the opportunity to write this part of our history. It's long overdue, 17 years since we were first told Tasmanians deserve to have their human rights formally protected via legislation. I also flag, Mr President, my intention to seek to table at the conclusion of my contribution the TLRI's update report on the Charter of Human Rights for Tasmania, dated April 2024. To move on to another topic, Mr President, which is not just an opportunity reform, but given its urgency, could as easily have been discussed as unfinished business. Lutruwita, Tasmania faces significant fiscal challenges, which are now looming. We have been alerted to this by independent experts, such as Saul Eslake, and strongly by members in this place, such as the member for Murchison, who speaks on it regularly. We know that our state cannot rely on business as usual to meet the significant fiscal challenges we face. We will need to take the politically awkward action of reforming Tasmania's taxation and revenue base. Therefore, we have an opportunity in this 51st Parliament to plan and take these politically awkward actions together as a product of collaboration. We can seek to share the political risk rather than seek to avoid it or use it as a weapon for political self-advantage. The call for structural reform of the state's taxation base and revenue streams is not new, nor is it a challenge only faced by Tasmania. We know clearly from Treasury's own modelling the need for reform is pressing. We cannot continue to keep putting this fundamental work into the too hard basket. We all know we cannot rely upon pulling the same tax and revenue levers just a little harder when those levers cannot keep up with the needs and the priorities of Tasmanians. We all know in this place, plain as day, that robust taxation reform for our state is now desperately overdue and necessary to ensure the sustainability of Tasmania's overall fiscal position. Many, many times we have been warned by economist Mr Saul Eslake and others that fiscal sustainability for our state cannot be attained solely by relying on economic growth or by other single solutions such as constraining health expenditure or public sector efficiency dividends and the like. It's certainly a nonsense for any government claiming to have a 2030 strong plan for our state that such a plan appears completely devoid of thorough structural reform of the state taxation and revenue base. I reiterate the call I made in this place after the 2021-22 state budget that we must have a comprehensive independent review to our state taxation and revenue system to ensure it's as robust as possible and pulling appropriate levers to drive necessary sustainability while improving fairness and efficiency. I propose in this 51st Parliament, with its new collaborative atmosphere, there's an opportunity to establish an independent expert panel commissioned by Parliament to undertake a review into state taxation and revenue reform. It's finally time to pull this band-aid off, Mr President. Mr President, I'll move on to another topic of which I'm fond and I believe presents us with a significant opportunity for reform, one that I'm happy to be an active contributor to progressing, in fact. And that's the topic of our privacy legislation and protections in Lutruwita, Tasmania. In late 2019, I made a referral to the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute, which was accepted by the TLRI board in December of that year. I asked the TLRI to inquire into and review and report on the current protections of privacy and the right to privacy in Tasmania and any need to enhance or extend protections for privacy in Tasmania. Also, the extent to which the Personal Information Protection Act 2004 and related laws continue to provide an effective framework for the protection of privacy in Tasmania and the need for any reform to that Act. And finally, models that enhance and protect privacy in other jurisdictions in Australia and overseas. I'd like to thank the TLRI for continuing with that referred project, especially through a difficult time of constrained funding in recent years, which delayed the progress for a while. After the release by the TLRI of an excellent issues paper for comment on the topic in March 2023, I very much look forward to the culmination of their work in its final report. The issues paper identified this: there is no comprehensive privacy regulation in Tasmania. Rather, privacy protection is fragmented across different laws that protect different types of privacy in different specific circumstances. And further, that despite Tasmania's Personal Information Protection Act being the state's primary privacy framework, It said there are multiple gaps in its scope, operation and enforcement that can jeopardise privacy. Mr President, I anticipate the final report from the TLRI will provide an excellent roadmap for reform and improvement in our legislative architecture relating to privacy. Addressing those noted gaps and fragmentation will be an opportunity for better privacy protection for our fellow Tasmanians. Mr President, another area which some members here will recall I've raised and will continue to raise is the need to incorporate as an automatic part of any assessment of government policy making the rigorous and informed use of a gender lens. Whether it's in discussions on matters ranging anywhere from public transport routes through to construction, prioritised investments, boosting our workforce. An effective and rigorous and consistent application of a gender lens on all areas of policy is integral to a just, fair and equitable Tasmania. Currently, Tasmania's chapter in this regard is looking a little bit like the least liked part of the government's homework. It's a bit tatty, a scribbled note in the margin of an unformed draft where an assessor would comment more application is required. I think that there's lots of opportunity for collaborative work on improving this area, Mr President, and I think there's members across both houses of this place that would be more than happy to look at contributing to that work. Mr President, I welcome the commitment made by the Premier, as referred to in the Governor's address, that, and I quote, "The new government's decision and actions to be taken in the best interests of the state and to be a government that listens to all Tasmanians." I welcome that commitment, very much so. Too often over the last few iterations of government, we've seen deaf ears turned to many sectors and groups within our society, notably many vulnerable Tasmanians. Too often we saw decisions made which were arguably in the best interests of the government and more specifically the party in government. I'm focused in my contribution today, Mr President, on opportunities presented by this new 51st Parliament, and I'm not going to get bogged down in detailed critique of the government's 2030 plan. There will be a budget reply speech later in the year for that. In the spirit of optimism on opportunities before us, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome a range of government initiatives and commitments outlined in the Governor's address, which I see as positive and welcome for the Tasmanian community, including the electorate of Nelson. For example, the energy bill relief for households and small businesses to be provided this winter will be a tangible assistance for those struggling to cover the basics. The halving of bus fees and fares and Derwent ferry fares from the 1st of June will be an important support to those on low incomes relying on public transport, but also a welcome incentive to make public transport a more attractive option for all and assist us in reducing transport emissions. Having mentioned ferries, I note the exciting announcement of 3 additional ferry terminals, including one in Sandy Bay, which is of course at one end of the Nelson electorate. And I do look forward, perhaps one day, to celebrating an announcement of a further expansion of the Derwent River ferry service to also link Kingston, the other end of the Nelson electorate, into the current routes. I hope that's part of the planning. I welcome and applaud, Mr President, the continued support and extension of the Healthy School Lunch program in schools. This may seem a small matter, but actually it's an essential. It's a matter of not just supporting the educational outcomes of children attending school by ensuring that they have full bellies while they're there, but it's also especially important for overall wellbeing and will flow back into families and into communities as a positive impact. The continued commitment, I also celebrate to building 10,000 more social and affordable homes by 2032. That's an ongoing move in the right direction. In particular, the target of at least 2,000 social housing only homes by 30 June 2027. Other housing initiatives that are a positive include the enhanced My Home program around home ownership, the private rental incentive scheme being boosted by an extra 200 properties, and incentives to switch properties from the short stay market into the private rental market. These efforts, Mr President, are not enough, and it's unfortunate that other housing policies will work to exacerbate from the other side rather than ameliorate the housing crisis in Tasmania, but I'm not delving into detailed criticism today. There are some good initiatives there. It's also excellent to see 4 new child and family learning centres being added to the existing network across the state. These are beautiful facilities and effective community-based support for families and children during early years. We are certainly excited to see the Saltbush Child and Family Learning Centre being built in Kingston and due to open this year. It will be a wonderful addition to the Kingborough community. Staying on the topic of supporting Tassie children, I welcome the announced Early Years Workforce Fund, which includes scholarships and incentives to attract and retain early childhood workers, speech pathologists and psychologists. These are sorely needed positions in this state. It's excellent to see the commitment to implement evidence-based structured literacy in all schools, including phonics and a Year 1 phonics check for all Year 1 students. This provides the opportunity, Mr President, to make a generational change in our literacy levels in Lutruwita, Tasmania. Health is an enormous task for any government in this state, Mr President, and I note this government continues to seek new initiatives and solutions to tackle the multitude of challenges it presents. I particularly note efforts announced in the Governor's address to improve access to GPs, which we all know is an urgent issue. While health announcements overall still have the feeling that we are desperately sticking our fingers into the cracks in the damn wall, I know there are many with expert knowledge and experience working to develop better policy and investment approaches in this area, and I hope and trust that the government is listening to those experts. At budget time, we'll certainly delve more deeply into that space. Mr President, this government continues to focus on developing vocational education and training opportunities with the need to ensure workforce availability in our state. That certainly aligns with the government's future infrastructure plans, which they also lay out in the Governor's address, and both these areas are important in planning for a future in which Lutruwita, Tasmania can thrive. Mr President, before I conclude, I would like to seek leave to table the reports I mentioned earlier in my remarks.
Certainly, Honourable Member. I am advised that a lot of the documents are public documents already, but the call is yours.
As are many documents tabled in this place, Mr President, I'm just tabling them to be associated, as they are directed to this Parliament, tabling them to be part of the parliamentary record. May I seek leave to table the documents?
The Honourable Member for Nelson seeks leave to table documents. The question is leave granted? Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr President, and for others' support for that. Mr President, clearly there are many other areas we could include in discussing here. However, I'm aware of time and others' patience, so I appreciate. Instead, I'll conclude my comments by reiterating the optimistic welcome I give to this 51st Parliament. I genuinely hope to see and contribute to positive opportunities in the term of this Parliament, especially the opportunity to progress reforms that require collaboration and may otherwise be too politically challenging. We are all involved in writing history here, writing the next chapter of Lutruwita, Tasmania's story. Posterity will judge us if we continue to write the same old preferential treatments and silencings and absences. I hope we may seize this moment in all its potential for the benefit of all Tasmanians. I note the Governor's address.